The moment Florence Fairchild saw her reflection in the full-length mirror, dressed in her mother's ivory wedding gown with its too-tight bodice and endless train, she knew she could not walk down that aisle and become Mrs. Harrison Whitmore, no matter how much her father had invested in the match or how many guests waited in the pews of the Stillwater, Arizona church. It was June 1883, and the morning sun blazed through the window of the bride's preparation room adjacent to the sanctuary, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to her panic. Florence pressed her palm against her stomach, trying to quell the nausea that had been building since dawn. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of voices, the rustling of expensive fabric, the clearing of important throats. Harrison's family had come from back east, wealthy investors in the railroad that was supposed to bring progress and prosperity to this corner of the Arizona territory. Her father, Richard Fairchild, owner of the largest cattle ranch in the region, saw the marriage as a bridge between old Western wealth and new Eastern capital. But Florence saw it as a cage. She had tried to tell her father that Harrison's polite smiles never reached his eyes, that his hand gripped her elbow too tightly when they walked, that he spoke to her as though she were a child who needed constant correction. She had tried to explain the cold pit of dread in her stomach whenever he was near. Her father had dismissed her concerns as pre-wedding jitters, as a young woman's natural fear of leaving her childhood home. At 22 years old, Florence was hardly a child, but her opinions held little weight against the financial arrangements already made, the contracts already signed. The door creaked open and her younger sister Mary peeked inside, already dressed in her bridesmaid gown of pale yellow. "Papa says it is time, Florence. The musicians are ready to begin." Florence turned from the mirror, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs from the inside. "Mary, I cannot do this." Mary's eyes widened. At 19, she still believed in fairy tales and happy endings arranged by fathers who knew best. "Do not be silly. Everyone has nerves on their wedding day. Harrison is a good match. You will learn to love him." "I will learn to die inside," Florence whispered, but Mary had already retreated, her footsteps quick on the wooden floor. Florence looked around the small room frantically. There was the door to the sanctuary, where 200 guests waited. There was the door her sister had just exited, which led to the main hall where her father was certainly pacing. And there was a small window, partially open to let in the morning breeze. She did not think. She simply moved. Gathering her skirts in both hands, Florence climbed onto the window ledge, her heart in her throat. The window overlooked the back of the church, where the livery stable stood, and where the horses waited to carry the wedding party to the reception at her father's ranch. She could hear someone starting to play the organ, the opening notes of the processional that should have been her cue to take her father's arm. Instead, Florence squeezed through the window, her dress catching on the frame. She heard the terrible sound of expensive fabric ripping but did not stop. She dropped into the dirt below, stumbling in her impractical white boots. For a moment she stood frozen, waiting for someone to shout to discover her, to drag her back inside. But the music continued, and no alarm was raised. She ran. Her veil flew off within the first few steps, caught by a gust of hot desert wind. Her carefully arranged hair began to tumble from its pins. She did not care. She ran past the livery, past the neat rows of buggies and horses, toward the edge of town where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. She had no plan, no destination, only the overwhelming need to escape the life that had been chosen for her. Stillwater sat in a valley surrounded by red rock formations and vast expanses of scrubland, dotted with saguaro cacti and creosote bushes. Beyond the town limits, there were few landmarks, just the unforgiving landscape that had claimed the lives of many unprepared travelers. Florence knew she should be afraid, but the fear of what lay behind her was greater than the fear of what lay ahead. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, until the church was just a white speck in the distance. Only then did she stop, bending double to catch her breath, her ruined dress dragging in the red dirt. The reality of what she had done began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had no horse, no water, no supplies. She was dressed in a wedding gown in the middle of the desert, and soon everyone would know she had fled. Her father would be humiliated. Harrison would be furious. They would come looking for her, and when they found her, she would be dragged back and forced to go through with the marriage anyway, only with her reputation in tatters and her spirit finally broken. Tears of frustration and fear pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying would not help. She needed to think. She needed a plan. She needed something she had never had before, a choice about her own future. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. She spun around, expecting to see her father or one of his ranch hands coming to retrieve her. Instead, she saw a lone rider approaching from the west, leading a pack horse behind him. The man sat easy in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the sun. He wore the practical clothing of someone who made his living on the land, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest. As he drew closer, Florence could see he was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, with several days of stubble on his jaw and eyes that looked both kind and cautious. He reined in his horse about 10 feet from where she stood, his gaze taking in her bizarre appearance with an expression that might have been amusement if it were not so carefully neutral. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, "are you all right?" Florence opened her mouth to lie, to say she was perfectly fine, but what came out instead was a half-laugh, half-sob. "No, no, I am very much not all right." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, leaving his horses ground-tied. He approached her slowly as though she were a skittish animal that might bolt. Up close, Florence could see he had warm brown eyes and sun-weathered skin, the permanent tan of someone who spent his life outdoors. "Are you hurt? Did someone harm you?" "Not yet," Florence said, and then realized how strange that must sound. "I mean, I am not hurt, not physically, but I will be when they find me, when they drag me back." The cowboy's expression darkened. "Who is looking to drag you somewhere you do not want to go, my father?" "My would-be husband. Everyone in Stillwater, probably." Florence gestured at her dress. "I fled my wedding. I ran away, and I do not intend to go back, but I am not entirely certain what to do next." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, and Florence found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze. Finally, he said, "I am Elijah Morrison. I work the ranches between here and Tucson, mostly breaking horses and mending fences. I do not know you, and I do not know your situation, but I know this. No woman should be forced to marry against her will. That is a fact." The simple declaration, stated with such certainty, made Florence want to cry again, but this time with relief. Someone believed her. Someone understood. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name is Florence Fairchild." Elijah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Richard Fairchild's daughter?" "Yes." Florence braced herself for judgment, for Elijah to tell her she was being foolish, that her father only wanted what was best for her. Instead, Elijah just nodded. "I worked at your father's ranch 2 summers ago. He is a hard man, fair in his business dealings, but hard." He paused, then asked gently, "Where were you planning to go, Miss Fairchild?" "I do not know," Florence admitted. "I just knew I could not stay. I could not marry Harrison Whitmore." I could not spend the rest of my life being told what to think and what to say and what to feel." Her voice broke on the last word. Elijah was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have a camp about 3 miles west of here, up in the rocks where there is shade and a spring. You could come there, at least long enough to figure out your next move. Get out of this sun before you get heat stroke in that dress." Florence knew she should be cautious. She knew nothing about this man except his name and the kindness in his eyes. But what choice did she have? Return to Stillwater and face her father's anger, wander the desert alone until exposure or wildlife finished her. She looked at Elijah, at his weathered hands and honest face, and made a decision to trust him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, please. I would be grateful." Elijah nodded and walked back to his horses. He returned leading the pack horse, which he helped Florence mount despite the ridiculous volume of her skirts. The wedding dress had not been designed for riding, and Florence had to gather the fabric in great bunches around her legs. Elijah pretended not to notice her struggle, his manner respectful and professional. Once she was settled, he mounted his own horse and started west, keeping to a pace that was quick enough to put distance between them and Stillwater, but not so fast that Florence, an experienced rider despite her current attire, could not keep up. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Florence kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see a cloud of dust that would signal pursuers, but the horizon remained clear. Perhaps they had not yet discovered her absence. Perhaps they were still waiting in the church, wondering why the bride had not appeared. The thought of Harrison standing at the altar, of her father's face when he realized what she had done, sent a wave of guilt through her. But beneath the guilt was something else, something bright and fierce: relief. She had escaped. She was free, at least for now. Elijah led them away from the flat desert floor toward a formation of red rocks that jutted up from the earth like the bones of some ancient giant. As they climbed higher, the air grew slightly cooler, and Florence could smell the mineral scent of stone and the faint sweetness of some desert bloom. Finally, they rounded a large boulder and entered a small canyon where a thin stream of water trickled from a crack in the rock face, forming a small pool before disappearing into the sand below. A simple camp was set up beneath an overhang: a bedroll, a cook fire ring, supplies neatly packed in saddlebags. Elijah dismounted and helped Florence down, his hands gentle and impersonal on her waist. Once she was on solid ground, he stepped back immediately, maintaining a proper distance. "The water is clean," he said, gesturing to the spring. "You can drink from it, wash if you like. I will go tend to the horses." Florence nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried her through her escape was fading, leaving her shaky and spent. She made her way to the pool and knelt beside it, cupping the cool water in her hands and drinking deeply. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She splashed water on her face, not caring that it ruined what remained of the cosmetics her mother had carefully applied that morning. When she looked up, Elijah was unsaddling the horses on the other side of the camp, giving her privacy. The simple courtesy touched her. Harrison would never have thought to give her space. He would have hovered, commenting on everything she did, offering unwanted advice and criticism disguised as concern. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, "I do not know how to thank you for your kindness." Elijah looked up from his work. "Just Elijah is fine, and you do not need to thank me. What you needed was help, and I was there to give it. That is all." But it was not all, and Florence knew it. He had taken a significant risk by helping her. Richard Fairchild was a powerful man in this territory, and he would not take kindly to anyone who aided his daughter's escape. If her father found out Elijah's role in this, there could be consequences. You could face trouble for helping me, Florence said, voicing her concern. Elijah shrugged, his expression unconcerned. I have faced trouble before. I will face it again. Right now, my concern is keeping you safe and helping you figure out what comes next. He finished with the horses and came to sit on a rock near the fire ring, careful to maintain a respectful distance from where Florence sat by the pool. Do you have family elsewhere? Somewhere you could go? Florence shook her head. My mother's sister lives in San Francisco, but I have not seen her since I was a child, and I have no money for train fare. No money at all, in fact. The realization of just how unprepared she was for independence struck her hard. She had been raised to be a wife, trained in music and manners and household management, but she had no practical skills for surviving on her own. She could not cook over a campfire. She did not know how to shoot or hunt. She had never earned her own money or made her own way in the world. That is all right, Elijah said calmly. We will figure something out. For now, you are safe here. Your father and his men will not think to look this far out, not right away. They will probably search the town first, check the train station, question everyone. That buys us some time. Us. Florence repeated, surprised by the pronoun. Elijah met her eyes steadily. I am not going to leave you to deal with this alone, Miss Fairchild, not unless you want me to. Florence, she said softly. Please call me Florence, and no, I do not want you to go. The admission felt vulnerable, but also honest. She needed help, and more than that, something about Elijah made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a very long time. They spent the rest of the day in the canyon, hiding from the worst heat of the afternoon sun. Elijah proved to be a man of practical resourcefulness. He produced hardtack and dried beef from his supplies and made a simple meal that tasted like a feast to Florence's empty stomach. As they ate, they talked. Florence told him about her childhood on the ranch, about her love of the desert landscape, despite its harshness, about her years in a finishing school in Phoenix that had polished her into a proper young lady while squashing everything wild and genuine inside her. She told him about Harrison, about the way he looked at her like she was a possession he had purchased, about her father's deaf ears to her objections. Elijah listened without interruption, his attention complete and focused in a way that made Florence feel truly heard for the first time in years. When she finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted from the confession, he said quietly, You did the right thing. Running, I mean. Some people will say you should have honored your commitment, that you should have done your duty to your family. But I think being true to yourself matters more than any of that. You only get one life, Florence. You should not have to spend it being miserable to make other people comfortable. The words settled into Florence's chest, warm and affirming. Do you really believe that? I do, Elijah said. I spent the first 20 years of my life trying to be the son my father wanted. He was a shopkeeper in Tucson, wanted me to take over the family business, spend my days behind a counter making change and stacking shelves. But I wanted to be outside, working with horses, moving with the seasons. When I finally told him I was going to work ranches instead, he said I was throwing my life away, that I would amount to nothing. Elijah's expression was sad but accepting. We have not spoken in 4 years. I do not regret my choice, but I regret the hurt it caused. Still, I would rather have a hard life that is mine than an easy life that belongs to someone else. Florence understood exactly what he meant. The sunlight slanting into the canyon was turning golden, the color of hope and possibility. For the first time since she had agreed to marry Harrison, she felt like she could breathe fully. As evening fell, Elijah built a small fire and spread his bedroll for Florence beneath the rock overhang. You take the sheltered spot, he said when she tried to protest. I will sleep by the fire. I am used to it. That night, Florence lay wrapped in Elijah's blanket, staring up at more stars than she had ever seen, even growing up in the desert. The wedding dress lay in a ruined heap nearby, a discarded symbol of a life she had rejected. She should have felt afraid, uncertain, lost. Instead, she felt alive. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Florence woke to find Elijah already up, making coffee over the fire. He had refilled the canteen at the spring and set out more of his simple provisions for breakfast. "We need to make a plan," he said as Florence joined him. "You cannot stay in this camp forever, and neither can I. I am expected at a ranch south of here in 2 days to start a job breaking their new horses." "Of course," Florence said quickly. "I do not expect you to append your life for me. You have already done more than anyone could ask." Elijah shook his head. "That is not what I meant. I am not abandoning you, Florence. I am just saying we need to figure out the next step." He poured coffee into a battered tin cup and handed it to her. "I was thinking, if you want, you could come with me. The Mercado Ranch where I am headed is run by a widow, Senora Mercado, and her 3 daughters. They are good people. I think Senora Mercado might be willing to hire another hand, especially a woman who could help in the house. It would give you a place to stay, a way to earn money, and it would put another 40 miles between you and Stillwater." Hope flickered in Florence's chest. "Do you really think she would hire me? I have no references. My father would never give me one now." "You do not need your father's reference. I will vouch for you. Tell her you are a friend in need of work. Senora Mercado does not care much for the social rules that people like your father and Harrison Whitmore set store by. She cares about hard work and good character." Elijah met her eyes. "Besides, I think you have more strength in you than you give yourself credit for. You were brave enough to run. You will be brave enough to build something new." The words filled Florence with a determination she had not known she possessed. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I want to try." They spent that day preparing for the journey. Elijah had a spare shirt and a pair of pants that he helped Florence modify to fit her well enough, cinching the waist with a belt and rolling up the cuffs. It was strange at first, wearing men's clothing, feeling the freedom of trousers instead of the restriction of skirts and petticoats. But it was also liberating. She could move easily, walk without worrying about dragging fabric through the dirt. When she caught her reflection in the spring water, she barely recognized herself. Hair pulled back in a simple braid, face scrubbed clean of powder and paint, dressed like a working woman instead of a society ornament. "You look more like yourself," Elijah observed, and Florence realized he was right. This was who she had always been beneath the layers of expectation and performance. They buried the wedding dress beneath a pile of rocks, and Florence felt like she was burying more than just fabric and lace. She was burying her old life, the old Florence who had been too afraid to choose her own path. They left the canyon the next morning at dawn, heading south across the desert. Elijah set a steady pace, choosing routes that kept them away from the main roads where they might encounter travelers who could carry word back to Stillwater. Florence had wondered if riding astride in trousers would be scandalous, but out here, far from the judgment of society, it just felt natural. As they rode, Elijah taught her things. He showed her how to read the landscape for water, how to identify the plants that were edible versus those that were poisonous, how to follow game trails and recognize the tracks of different animals. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for her lack of knowledge. In return, Florence found herself talking more freely than she ever had with anyone, sharing her thoughts and dreams and fears without the careful filtering she had always employed around others. "I always wanted to see the ocean," she confided as they rested the horses in the meager shade of a Palo Verde tree. "When I was a girl, A traveling salesman came to the ranch with stereoscope cards from San Francisco. One showed the Pacific, these huge waves crashing against rocks. I used to imagine what it would be like to stand on the shore and watch all that water moving, so different from the desert. Maybe you will see it someday, Elijah said. Nothing is stopping you now. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Nothing was stopping her. For the first time in her life, her future was unwritten, full of possibilities instead of obligations. They made camp that night in a dry wash, the stars once again providing a canopy of light. As they sat by the fire, Elijah said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What was it about Harrison that made you so certain you could not marry him?" "I am not questioning your choice. I am just curious." Florence considered the question, trying to find the right words. It was not one thing. It was 1,000 small things that added up to something unbearable. The way he corrected me constantly, as though I could not be trusted to speak or think correctly on my own. The way he talked about our future children like they were investments to be managed. The way he once grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises because I had laughed too loudly at something and he thought I was being undignified. She paused, the memory still sharp. But more than any of that, it was the realization that if I married him, I would spend the rest of my life making myself smaller and quieter and less, until there was nothing left of who I really was. I would rather face an uncertain future alone than a certain future where I lose myself entirely. Elijah nodded slowly. That makes sense. I think a lot of people stay in situations that are slowly killing them because they are more afraid of the unknown than they are of their misery. It takes courage to choose the unknown. Or desperation, Florence said with a slight smile. Sometimes courage and desperation look a lot alike, Elijah countered, and Florence found herself laughing, surprised by the ease she felt in his company. They reached the Mercado Ranch late the following afternoon. The property was smaller than her father's spread but well maintained, with a comfortable adobe house, a sturdy barn, and corrals that held several dozen horses. Senora Mercado herself came out to greet them, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, weathered brown skin, and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through to the truth of things. Elijah dismounted and greeted her in Spanish, too rapid for Florence to follow with her limited understanding of the language. Senora Mercado's gaze shifted to Florence, assessing, and Florence resisted the urge to fidget under that penetrating stare. Finally, the older woman nodded and switched to English. "Elijah says you need work and a place to stay. He says you are trustworthy and a hard worker. His word is good with me, so I will give you a chance. I can offer you room and board and a small wage to help in the house and with the horses. My daughters and I run this place ourselves since my husband died 3 years ago. We can always use an extra pair of hands, but I expect honesty and effort. Can you give me that?" "Yes, madam," Florence said, meeting Senora Mercado's eyes directly. "I will not lie to you. I am running from a forced marriage. My family does not know where I am, and I would like to keep it that way. But I am willing to work hard, and I will earn my place here." Something that might have been approval flickered across Senora Mercado's face. "Fair enough. We all have things in our past we would rather leave behind. What matters is what you do now." She turned and called toward the house. "Rosa, Isabella, Maria, come meet the new help." 3 young women emerged from the house, ranging in age from what Florence guessed was 18 to perhaps 25. The oldest, who introduced herself as Rosa, had her mother's sharp eyes and direct manner. The middle daughter, Isabella, was softer, with a ready smile. The youngest, Maria, looked at Florence with frank curiosity. "This is Florence," Senora Mercado said. She will be staying with us for a while. Rosa, show her to the spare room and get her settled. Elijah, you know where your bunk is in the barn. We will talk about the horses in the morning. Just like that, Florence had a place. It was not what she had imagined when she had climbed out the church window 3 days ago, but it was hers, earned by her own choice and her own courage. The next weeks settled into a rhythm. Florence learned quickly that life on the Mercado Ranch was nothing like life in her father's house. There were no servants to cook and clean, no hired hands to do every task. Everyone worked, and worked hard. Florence helped Rosa in the kitchen, learning to make tortillas and pozole and tamales. She helped Isabella tend the vegetable garden, coaxing food from the harsh soil. She helped Maria mend tack and clean stalls. Her hands, which had been soft and carefully maintained, grew calloused and strong. At first, everything was difficult. She burned food. She cut her fingers on thorns. She fell into bed each night so exhausted she could barely move. But slowly she grew capable. She learned. She adapted. And she discovered something surprising. She was happy. The work was hard, but it was real, and at the end of each day she could see what she had accomplished. There was satisfaction in that, a sense of purpose she had never found in her old life of social calls and needlework and piano playing. Elijah worked with the horses, breaking the wild ones to saddle, training the young ones for ranch work. Florence often found excuses to watch him in the corral, mesmerized by his patience and skill. He never forced the horses, never used cruelty to bend them to his will. Instead, he worked with their nature, earning their trust, showing them that the saddle and bridle were not instruments of imprisonment but tools for partnership. She saw the same gentleness he had shown her reflected in how he treated the animals, and something warm unfurled in her chest whenever she watched him work. They still talked in the evenings after the work was done, and the family gathered in the courtyard to enjoy the cooling air. Sometimes the conversations included everyone, the Mercado women sharing stories of their lives, their losses, their small triumphs. Other times, Florence and Elijah would drift to the edge of the gathering, speaking quietly to each other about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Tucson, about his mother who had died when he was 12, about his complicated relationship with his father. She told him about her mother, a gentle woman who had been so beaten down by her marriage to Richard Fairchild that she was more ghost than person. She told him about Mary and hoped her sister was all right in the aftermath of Florence's disappearance. "You regret leaving?" Elijah asked one night, about a month after they had arrived at the ranch. Florence considered the question seriously. "I regret hurting my mother and my sister. I regret the scandal and difficulty my actions caused them, but I do not regret leaving. I would do it again. I would do it 100 times. Elijah smiled, a genuine expression that made his whole face transform. "Good. You deserve to be free, Florence." "So do you," she said softly, and his smile widened. It was Rosa who first commented on what was becoming increasingly obvious. One evening, she and Florence were washing dishes after supper while the others lingered at the table. "You care for him," Rosa said bluntly. "Elijah." Florence nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Rosa gave her a knowing look. "You watch him when you think no one is looking. You smile more when he is around, and he is the same with you. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Florence said firmly, scrubbing at the plate with unnecessary force. "I have just escaped one marriage. The last thing I need is to fall into another entanglement." "Love is not an entanglement," Rosa said. "At least not when it is the right person. My father, he was a good man. He and my mother, they were partners. They worked together, laughed together, supported each other. That is what love should be, not a prison but a partnership." Florence set down the plate and the washing rag, her hands shaking slightly. "I am afraid," she admitted. "What if I am not capable of telling the difference between a good man and a bad one? I thought Harrison seemed acceptable at first, before I agreed to marry him. What if my judgment cannot be trusted?" Rosa turned to face her fully, her expression serious. "Did Harrison ever help you without expecting anything in return? Did he ever listen to your fears and treat them as valid? Did he ever put your needs before his own?" "No," Florence said quietly. "And has Elijah done all those things?" "Yes." "Then you can trust your judgment." Rosa squeezed Florence's shoulder gently. "I am not saying you have to marry him tomorrow or even tell him how you feel, but do not let fear keep you from something good. You ran away from the wrong man. Maybe it is time to run toward the right one." The words stayed with Florence, working their way into her thoughts. She began to notice things she had been trying not to see. The way Elijah's face lit up when she approached. The way he always made sure she had the best portions at meals. The way he found excuses to work near wherever she was working, just so they could exchange words throughout the day. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his expression soft with something that looked very much like longing. And she had to acknowledge what she had been denying even to herself. She had feelings for him too, deep feelings that went beyond gratitude for his rescue or appreciation for his kindness. When she was near him, the world felt brighter. When he smiled at her, her heart raced. When they talked, she felt seen and understood in a way she never had before. She was falling in love with Elijah Morrison, and the realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. 2 months after Florence had arrived at the ranch, word reached them from Stillwater. A trader passing through mentioned that Richard Fairchild was still looking for his daughter, that he had put out a notice offering a reward for information about her whereabouts. Harrison Whitmore had returned to the East, the wedding scandal apparently too much for his family's dignity to bear. Florence's mother had taken to her bed with nerves, and Mary had been sent to live with relatives in Phoenix to escape the gossip. The news left Florence feeling sick with guilt, but also strangely relieved. At least Harrison was gone. At least she would never have to face becoming his wife. And her father, for all his power and wealth, had not found her. She was still free. That evening she found Elijah in the barn, checking on a mare who was due to foal. The barn was dim and quiet, smelling of hay and horses and leather. Elijah looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. "I heard about the news from Stillwater," he said. "Are you all right?" Florence leaned against the stall door, suddenly exhausted. "I do not know. I feel guilty about the pain I caused my mother and sister, but I also know I made the right choice." "It is possible to feel both things at once, I suppose." "It is," Elijah agreed. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "For what it is worth, I am glad you made the choice you did. Glad you ran. Glad I found you." Florence turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "Why?" "Because meeting you changed something in me," Elijah said, his voice low and honest. "I have spent the last few years drifting, taking jobs where I could find them, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I told myself I liked the freedom, the movement, but I think I was just lonely and did not want to admit it." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "These past 2 months, being here with you, I have felt something I have not felt since I left my father's house. I have felt like I have a home. Not because of the place, but because of the person I am with." Florence's breath caught in her throat. "Elijah, I feel the same way. I was so afraid to acknowledge it because I was afraid it would be another mistake, another way of losing myself. But Rosa helped me understand that there is a difference between losing yourself and finding someone who sees you clearly and loves who you actually are." She took a deep breath and said the words that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I love you. I did not mean to, but I do." The smile that spread across Elijah's face was like sunrise. "I love you too, Florence. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you in that ridiculous wedding dress, so fierce and scared and determined, and I have been falling deeper every day since." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," Florence whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and sure and perfect. The kiss was nothing like the chaste, awkward kisses Harrison had given her during their engagement. This was real, warm, full of feeling. This was what all the novels had promised, but she had never believed she would experience. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together. "I do not know what happens next," Florence said, "but I know I want to face it with you." "Then we will figure it out together," Elijah said. "Whatever comes, we will face it side by side." They stood in the barn holding each other as the last light faded from the sky, and Florence felt something she had never felt before in her entire life. She felt safe, seen, and completely, wonderfully loved. The weeks that followed were the happiest Florence had ever known. She and Elijah made no secret of their feelings, and the Mercado family welcomed the relationship with warmth and approval. Senora Mercado pulled Florence aside one day and said simply, "He is a good man and you are good for each other. You have my blessing, for what it is worth." "It is worth everything," Florence said. Meaning it, she and Elijah talked about their future, about what they wanted and how they might build a life together. Elijah had saved money from his years of ranch work, and Florence was slowly building her own small savings from her wages. They began to dream of starting their own small ranch someday. Nothing grand. Just enough land to raise horses and maybe cattle, to build a simple house, to make a life that was theirs. But Florence knew there was something she needed to do first. She needed to face her past, not to return to it, but to find closure. 3 months after arriving at the Mercado Ranch, she told Elijah, "I want to write to my mother and my sister. I want them to know I am safe and happy. They do not need to know exactly where I am, but they deserve to know I am all right." Elijah nodded, understanding immediately. "Do you want help?" Florence shook her head. "I need to do this myself, but thank you." She spent an afternoon composing 2 letters, one to her mother and one to Mary. To her mother, she wrote of her regret for the pain and scandal she had caused but stood firm in her choice. She wrote that she had found work and safety, that she was no longer the frightened girl who had been pushed toward a marriage she did not want. She hoped her mother could forgive her, but even if forgiveness was not possible, she wanted her to know that Florence was, for the first time, truly happy. To Mary, she was more detailed. She wrote about the ranch, about the Mercado family, about learning to cook and garden and find satisfaction in hard work. She wrote about Elijah, about how he had helped her, about how she had fallen in love with a man who saw her as an equal partner. She wrote that she hoped Mary would not let their father pressure her into a marriage she did not want, that she would have the courage to choose her own path, even if it was different from the one Florence had chosen. She sent both letters to a friend from finishing school who lived in Phoenix, asking her to mail them from there so the postmark would not reveal Florence's location. She did not know if the letters would bring comfort or more pain, but she had to try. The reply came 6 weeks later, forwarded from Phoenix. It was from Mary, her handwriting rushed and slightly smudged as though she had been crying while she wrote. "My dearest Florence, you cannot imagine the relief I felt when I received your letter. Mother and I have been beside ourselves with worry. Father told everyone you had suffered a breakdown and been sent to a sanitarium back east, but we knew the truth. We knew you had run. I will not lie to you. The weeks after the wedding were terrible. Father was in a rage such as I have never seen. Harrison's family threatened legal action for breach of contract. The scandal was the talk of Stillwater and beyond. But as the weeks turned to months, things have begun to settle. Harrison is back east and has apparently become engaged to someone else. Father has slowly let go of his anger, though he will not speak your name. And Mother, I think, is secretly proud of you, though she would never say so aloud. As for me, your letters opened my eyes. I have begun to ask questions, to assert my own opinions, to push back when Father tries to make decisions for me without my input. It is hard and he does not like it, but I am learning to be brave like you were. I am so glad you are happy. I am so glad you found someone who loves you as you deserve to be loved. Perhaps someday, when enough time has passed, you can come home for a visit. I miss you terribly. All my love. Mary. Florence read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Elijah found her in the courtyard, holding the paper like a precious treasure, and she showed him the words. "They are all right," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "My mother and Mary are all right, and Mary is finding her own courage." Elijah pulled her into his arms and she cried against his chest, releasing the guilt and worry she had been carrying for months. When the tears finally subsided, she looked up at him and said, "I am ready now, ready to truly move forward. I want to build our future, Elijah. I want to start planning our life together." "Then let us start," he said, kissing her forehead gently. They worked and saved through the fall and into the winter. Elijah continued breaking horses, his reputation growing as word spread of his skill. Ranchers came from farther and farther away to hire him, and he was able to command better wages. Florence took on additional work, sewing and mending for people in the nearest town, adding to their savings. Senora Mercado, seeing their determination and their love, offered them advice and connections, introducing them to people who might be able to help when they were ready to start their own place. It was in early spring, nearly a year after Florence had fled her wedding, that Elijah came to her with news. "There is a property for sale," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "About 20 miles south of here. It is small, just 100 acres, but it has good water and grazing land. The owner died, and his widow is selling to move back east with her children. She is asking a fair price, something we could afford if we use our savings and take a small loan from the bank." Florence felt her heart leap. "Do you think we could really do it? Start our own ranch?" "I think we can do anything if we do it together," Elijah said. "But Florence, before we take this step, I have to ask you something properly." He got down on one knee right there in the courtyard, and Florence felt her breath catch. "Florence Fairchild, I love you more than I have ever loved anything or anyone. You are the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to face every joy and every challenge with you as my partner. Will you marry me?" Florence did not have to think. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him soundly. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The Mercado family celebrated the engagement with a feast and music and dancing. Rosa hugged Florence tight and whispered, "I told you so." Isabella made a beautiful dress for Florence to wear, simple and practical but lovely. Maria picked flowers from the desert to make a bouquet. Senora Mercado gave them her blessing and promised to help them get established on their new land. They were married on a warm spring day by a priest in the small church nearest to the Mercado ranch. Florence wore the dress Isabella had made, her hair loose around her shoulders, flowers tucked behind her ear. Elijah wore his best shirt and a new vest Rosa had sewn for him. There was no grand ceremony, no society guests, no elaborate reception. Just the Mercado family, a few friends Elijah had made over the years, and the priest speaking words of commitment and love. When the priest said, "You may kiss your bride," Elijah did so with such tenderness that Florence felt tears prick her eyes. This was nothing like the wedding she had fled. This was everything a wedding should be, a celebration of love freely given and joyfully received. After the ceremony, they all returned to the Mercado Ranch for a celebration. There was food and music, laughter and dancing. At one point, as Florence and Elijah danced together in the courtyard under the stars, she thought about how different her life was now compared to what it would have been if she had not climbed out that church window a year ago. If she had married Harrison, she would be miserable, trapped, slowly dying inside. Instead, she was here, married to a man she loved deeply, about to start a new life built on partnership and mutual respect. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked, his arms warm around her. "How glad I am that I ran," Florence said. "How grateful I am that you found me, how perfect this moment is." "It is only going to get better," Elijah promised, and she believed him. They moved to their new property a week after the wedding. The house was small, just 3 rooms, but it was solid and well built. They spent their first weeks cleaning and repairing, making the space their own. Elijah built Florence a proper kitchen, and she planted a garden. They purchased their first horses, young stock that Elijah planned to train and sell. It was hard work, exhausting work, but it was theirs. Every post they mended, every animal they tended, every meal they shared at their own table was a piece of the life they were building together. The first year was challenging. There were droughts and dust storms, sick animals and broken equipment, moments when Florence wondered if they had taken on too much too soon. But there were also triumphs. The first horse Elijah trained and sold for a good price. The first vegetables from Florence's garden. The first winter they survived on their own land, warm and safe in their small house while snow fell outside, and through it all, their love deepened. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's moods, each other's needs. They learned to work as a team, to communicate, to support each other through difficulties. They learned that marriage, real marriage built on love and respect, was not a prison but a partnership that made both of them stronger. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Florence said, "I want to write to Mary again. Ask her if she wants to come visit. I miss her, and I want her to see what we have built here." "That sounds good," Elijah said, squeezing her hand. "It is time. You have made your own life. You do not have to hide anymore." Florence sent the letter, and to her joy, Mary replied quickly that she would love to visit. She arrived in late summer, traveling by train and then by stagecoach, and when Florence saw her sister for the first time in over a year, they both cried and held each other for a long time. Mary stayed for 2 weeks, and Florence showed her everything: the house, the land, the horses, the garden. Mary helped with chores and learned to cook over a wood stove and got sunburned and laughed more freely than Florence had ever heard her laugh. In the evenings, the 3 of them would sit on the porch, and Mary would share news from Stillwater. Their mother was doing better, had even started going to church socials again. Their father had mellowed somewhat, focusing his energy on the ranch rather than on his anger at Florence's defection. The scandal had faded, replaced by newer gossip and concerns. "I think he would see you now if you wanted to visit," Mary said carefully. "I do not think he would apologize, but I think he has accepted that you are not coming back." Florence considered it. "Maybe someday, but not yet. I am not ready, and I am not sure he is either. Let more time pass. Let him see that I have built a good life, that my choice was not a disaster but a triumph." Mary nodded, understanding. Before she left, she pulled Florence aside and said, "Thank you for showing me this. For showing me that there is another way to live, that we do not have to accept what we are told we must accept. You saved yourself, and in doing so, you gave me permission to save myself too." "What do you mean?" Florence asked. Mary smiled. "I mean that I have told Father I will not be accepting any marriage proposals he arranges. I will choose my own husband when I am ready, or I will not marry at all." And he accepted it, Florence. He blustered and argued, but in the end he accepted it. "Because of what you did, because of the example you set." Florence hugged her sister tight, pride and love swelling in her chest. "I am so glad. Be brave, Mary, be true to yourself. That is all that matters." The years passed and the ranch grew. Elijah's reputation as a horse trainer spread, and they had more business than they could handle. Florence proved to have a natural talent for managing the financial side of things, keeping the books and negotiating prices, and making sure they stayed profitable. They hired a young man from the nearby town to help with the heavier work, and Florence taught his younger sister to cook in exchange for help in the house and garden. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Florence realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with excitement and terror in equal measure. She had never thought much about children when she was engaged to Harrison. The idea of bearing his children had been one more dreaded obligation. But the thought of having a child with Elijah, a child created from their love and raised in the life they had built together, felt like a gift. Elijah was overjoyed when she told him. He became ridiculously protective, trying to keep her from doing any heavy work, fussing over her health. Florence found it endearing and exasperating in equal measure. "I am pregnant, not fragile," she would remind him when he tried to stop her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup. Their son was born in early spring, delivered with the help of a midwife from town and Rosa Mercado, who came to stay for a month to help with the new baby. They named him Thomas, after Elijah's grandfather, a man Elijah remembered as kind and wise. Thomas had his father's brown eyes and his mother's determination, making his opinions known from day one. Parenthood was harder than Florence had expected, but also more rewarding. There was exhaustion and worry, sleepless nights and endless questions about whether they were doing everything right. But there was also joy. Thomas's first smile, his first laugh, his first steps. Watching Elijah with their son, seeing the gentleness and love in every interaction, made Florence fall in love with her husband all over again. When Thomas was 2, Florence found herself pregnant again, and their daughter Rebecca was born on a cold winter night, coming into the world with surprising speed and a lusty cry. With 2 children, the house that had once seemed perfectly adequate began to feel cramped, and Elijah began building an addition, working in the evenings and on Sundays to create more space for their growing family. Mary visited when she could, and she brought news that their mother was in declining health. "She asks about you," Mary told Florence during one visit. "She wants to see you and meet her grandchildren before she dies." Florence had known this moment would come eventually. She looked at Elijah, who nodded his support. "We will go," she said. "It is time." They made the journey to Stillwater when Thomas was 3 and Rebecca was 1, a long and tiring trip with 2 small children but necessary. Florence's heart pounded as their wagon rolled into town, past familiar landmarks that brought back memories both good and bad. Nothing had changed much, but Florence had changed completely. She was not the desperate girl who had fled her wedding. She was a woman, a wife, a mother, someone who had built a life through her own choices and her own strength. Her mother was in bed when they arrived at the ranch house, thinner and grayer than Florence remembered but with the same gentle eyes. When she saw Florence, she began to cry. "My girl, my brave girl, I am so glad you came." Florence sat beside the bed, holding her mother's fragile hand, and introduced her to Elijah and the children. Her mother's face transformed with joy as she held baby Rebecca and listened to Thomas's excited chatter. "You did the right thing," her mother whispered to Florence when they had a moment alone. "Running from that wedding. I wish I had been brave enough to do the same at your age, but I am glad you were." The words healed something in Florence that she had not realized still needed healing. Her mother died 2 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, and Florence was able to say goodbye properly, without regrets. Richard Fairchild attended the funeral but kept his distance from Florence and her family. It was Mary who finally forced a confrontation, insisting that their father at least acknowledge his daughter and meet his grandchildren. Richard was stiff and awkward, clearly uncomfortable, but he shook Elijah's hand and bent to look at Thomas and Rebecca with something that might have been regret in his eyes. "You have done well for yourself," he said gruffly to Florence. It was not an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and Florence decided it was enough. They returned to their ranch, to their life, and Florence felt like a chapter had finally closed. She had faced her past, made peace with what could be made peace with, and let go of the rest. Now she could move forward completely, without the weight of unfinished business holding her back. The years continued to pass in the way years do, marked by small joys and occasional sorrows, by the daily rhythms of ranch life and family life. Thomas and Rebecca grew, joined eventually by a third child, a son they named Samuel. The ranch prospered. Elijah became known throughout the territory as one of the finest horse trainers around. Florence's gardens became legendary, providing food for their family and surplus to sell in town. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, with a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch their children play. Mary eventually married, not a man their father chose, but a schoolteacher she met in Phoenix, a gentle man who treated her with respect and kindness. She brought him to visit the ranch, and Florence was glad to see her sister so happy, so free of the constraints that had once bound them both. On the 10th anniversary of the day Florence had climbed out the church window and run into the desert, she and Elijah sat on their porch after the children had gone to bed. The night was cool and clear, full of stars, and Florence leaned against her husband's shoulder, thinking about everything that had happened in those 10 years. "You ever regret it?" Elijah asked softly. "Running away, everything that came after?" Florence did not even have to think about her answer. "Never, not for a single moment. Running away from that wedding was the best decision I ever made. It led me to you, to this life, to everything that matters." "You were so brave," Elijah said, kissing the top of her head. "So brave to run, to choose yourself, to trust me when you had no reason to." "And you were so kind," Florence replied. "So kind to help a stranger in a wedding dress, to offer safety without expecting anything in return, to love me for who I am rather than who you wanted me to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Elijah said, "Do you remember what I said to you that day when we first talked about your running?" Florence smiled. "You said I should run to something, not just away from something." "I did. And I think you have spent these 10 years doing exactly that, running toward the life you wanted, toward becoming the person you were meant to be." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "And I feel honored that you chose to run toward me." "Always," Florence said. "I will always run toward you, toward us, toward this life we have built together." More years passed, and Florence and Elijah grew older together, weathered by sun and work and time, but still deeply in love. They watched their children grow into adults with their own dreams and paths. Thomas took over more of the horse training business, showing the same patience and skill his father had. Rebecca proved to have a head for numbers even better than her mother's and began managing the ranch's finances. Samuel, their youngest, had a wandering spirit but always came home, bringing stories of the places he had seen and the people he had met. The old wounds healed. Richard Fairchild, in his final years, softened enough to visit the ranch once, to sit on the porch with Florence and admit in his own gruff way that he had been wrong to try to force her into a marriage she did not want. It was not a full apology, not a complete reconciliation, but it was something, and Florence accepted it with grace. When he died, she went to his funeral without regret or unfinished anger. She had made peace with her past long ago. Mary remained close, visiting often with her own children, and the cousins grew up knowing each other, learning the same lessons of courage and choice that Florence and Mary had learned the hard way. The Mercado family remained dear friends throughout the years. Senora Mercado passed away peacefully surrounded by her daughters, and Florence mourned the woman who had given her a place when she needed it most. Rosa, Isabella, and Maria continued to run their ranch successfully, and their families and Florence's remained intertwined, celebrating holidays and milestones together. On the 20th anniversary of their wedding, Elijah surprised Florence with a trip. "I remember you once told me you always wanted to see the ocean," he said. "Let's go. Let's go to San Francisco and stand on the shore and watch the waves." They made the journey, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of their children, and traveled to California. Florence stood on the beach with her husband beside her, watching the Pacific Ocean crash against the rocks just as she had seen in that stereoscope card so many years ago. The reality was even better than the image. The salt smell of the air, the sound of the waves, the endless horizon. She felt Elijah's arm around her shoulders and leaned into him, grateful for every choice that had led her to this moment. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for finding me, for loving me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for being brave enough to run," Elijah replied. "For teaching me that home is not a place but a person, for choosing me every day for 20 years. And I will choose you every day for the rest of our lives," Florence promised. They returned to the ranch, to their children and grandchildren who were starting to arrive, to the land they had worked and loved for decades. The house was full of noise and laughter, of multiple generations gathered around the table, of stories told and retold, of love freely given and received. Florence and Elijah grew old together in the house they had built, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had chosen. They sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands, watching the sunset paint the desert in colors that never grew old. They talked about the past without regret and the future without fear. They counted themselves blessed, not because their life had been easy, but because they had faced every challenge together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had chosen each other freely and loved each other completely. When Florence was 70 years old, she sat on that porch with her husband of nearly 50 years and reflected on the journey that had started with her climbing out a church window in a wedding dress. She thought about how terrified she had been that day, how uncertain of everything except that she could not marry a man she did not love. She thought about Elijah finding her in the desert, offering help without hesitation, treating her with respect and kindness when she had been taught to expect neither. She thought about falling in love, about building a life from nothing, about the children and grandchildren who were the legacy of a choice made in desperation that had turned into the greatest blessing of her life. "You know what I think," Florence said to Elijah. "I think running away was not really about escaping. It was about running towards something I did not even know existed yet. I was running toward you, toward this life, toward becoming who I was meant to be. I just did not know it at the time." Elijah smiled, the same warm smile that had made her feel safe all those years ago. "And I think finding you that day was the best thing that ever happened to me. I had been drifting, looking for something without knowing what it was. And then there you were in that ridiculous dress, so fierce and scared and beautiful. And I knew even then that you were going to change my life." "We changed each other's lives," Florence said. "We saved each other." They sat together as the sun set. Two people who had taken a chance on each other half a century ago and built something beautiful from that choice. Around them, their family gathered. Children and their spouses, grandchildren running and playing, the next generation who would carry forward the legacy of courage and love that Florence and Elijah had established. Thomas came out onto the porch, his own hair starting to gray, and sat down with his parents. "Ma, Pa, dinner is almost ready. The whole family is here. We want to celebrate you." Florence looked at her eldest son, seeing the man he had become, and felt her heart swell with pride and love. "We will be right in. We are just enjoying the sunset." Thomas nodded and went back inside, and Florence heard the sounds of her family through the open door, laughter and conversation, the clatter of dishes being set, children's excited voices. It was the sound of a life well lived, of choices made with courage and love. As the last light faded from the sky, Elijah helped Florence to her feet, and they walked inside together, hand in hand, to join their family. The house was warm and bright, full of people who existed because Florence had been brave enough to run, and Elijah had been kind enough to help. As they sat down at the table, surrounded by 3 generations of love, Florence said a silent prayer of gratitude for the moment she had climbed out that window, for the cowboy who had found her, for every day since that had led to this perfect moment. After dinner, as the family lingered around the table sharing stories, Florence's youngest grandchild, a girl of 6 named Emily, climbed into her lap. "Grandma, will you tell us the story again, about how you and Grandpa met?" Florence looked at Elijah, who smiled and nodded. She had told this story many times over the years, and it never got old. "Well," she began, her voice warm with memory, "it all started on what was supposed to be my wedding day, but I was marrying the wrong man." The children leaned in, even though they had heard the story before. The adults grew quiet, listening to the familiar tale that had become family legend. Florence told them about climbing out the church window, about running into the desert, about a kind cowboy who had found her and offered help without expecting anything in return. She told them about falling in love, about building a life together, about the courage it took to choose yourself even when the world said you should not. "The most important thing I learned," Florence said, looking around at all the faces watching her, "is that sometimes you have to run away from the wrong thing so you can run toward the right thing. And when you find the right thing, the right person, you hold on tight and you build a life together based on respect and partnership and love. That is what your grandfather and I did, and we have never regretted it for a single moment." "Not one moment," Elijah agreed, reaching over to squeeze her hand. The evening grew late, and eventually the family began to disperse to their various rooms and homes, calling out good nights and see you in the mornings. Finally, Florence and Elijah were alone again, preparing for bed in the room they had shared for nearly 50 years. As Florence brushed her hair, now silver instead of brown, she caught Elijah's reflection in the mirror, watching her with the same love she had seen in his eyes on their wedding day. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Elijah said. "Grateful that you were brave, grateful that I was in the right place at the right time, grateful for every day we have had together." I am thinking about how I would not change a single thing about our life." Florence turned from the mirror and went to her husband, wrapping her arms around him. They stood together in the quiet room, two people who had faced the world together and won, and Florence felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. That night, as they lay in bed together in the darkness, Elijah said softly, "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" "When I found you in the desert, I said a lot of things that day," Florence replied. "What are you thinking of? You said you were running, but you did not know where you were running to, and I thought to myself, run to me. I did not say it out loud because it was too soon, too presumptuous. But I thought it. Run to me, Florence, not away from something, but to me." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, and I did. Maybe I did not know it then, but I was running to you, and I have been running to you every day since, choosing you, choosing us, choosing this life we built together. "Run to me, not away," Elijah whispered. "That is what I wished for you that day, and my wish came true." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Florence dreamed of running through the desert in a wedding dress, of a cowboy on horseback appearing like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to say, of a life stretching ahead full of promise and possibility and love. The years continued their steady march, as years always do, bringing changes and challenges, joys and sorrows. Florence and Elijah's health declined slowly, as is natural with age, but they faced it together with the same partnership that had defined their marriage from the beginning. They sat on their porch even when it was difficult to walk there, held hands even when arthritis made their joints ache, told each other, "I love you," every single day without fail. When Elijah's health took a serious turn, Florence refused to leave his side. She sat by his bed, holding his hand, telling him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the moments that had made their marriage a beautiful adventure. Their children and grandchildren gathered, and the house was once again full, this time with the bittersweet knowledge that they were saying goodbye. On a warm spring evening, with Florence holding one hand and Thomas holding the other, Elijah took his last breath. He went peacefully, a slight smile on his face, surrounded by the family that was his legacy. Florence felt her heart break and heal simultaneously, shattered by loss but made whole by gratitude for the life they had shared. "Thank you," she whispered to her husband one last time. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for every single day." In the months after Elijah's death, Florence grieved deeply but not bitterly. She had lost her partner, her best friend, her truest love, but she had also been blessed with 50 years of happiness. She had been loved completely and had loved completely in return. Not everyone got that in a lifetime. She had been one of the lucky ones. She stayed on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still sitting on the porch in the evenings even though the chair beside her was empty. She told stories to anyone who would listen, keeping Elijah's memory alive, making sure the next generation understood what real love looked like, what courage meant, what it took to build a life of meaning and purpose. On what would have been their 52nd wedding anniversary, Florence sat on the porch alone, watching the sunset paint the desert in those familiar, beautiful colors. She felt Elijah's presence beside her, not in a supernatural way, but in the way that someone you love deeply is always with you, woven into the fabric of who you are. "I am still running to you," she said softly to the evening air. "Every day, I am still running to you. And someday, when my time comes, I will run to you again, and we will be together as we were always meant to be." The sun set, and the stars came out, and Florence sat on the porch of the life she and Elijah had built together, content in the knowledge that she had lived fully, loved deeply, and chosen bravely. She had run away from the wrong life and run toward the right one, and she had found more happiness than she had ever dreamed possible. When Florence passed away peacefully in her sleep, 2 years later at the age of 73, surrounded by photographs of her family and mementos of her life, her last thought was of a day long ago when she had climbed out a church window in a wedding dress and run into the desert, terrified and desperate and brave. She thought of a cowboy on horseback who had offered help when she needed it most, who had loved her for exactly who she was, who had built a beautiful life with her over 50 years of partnership and devotion. Her children found her in the morning, a peaceful expression on her face, her hand reaching toward the empty space beside her where Elijah had slept for so many years. They mourned, but they also celebrated, knowing their mother had lived exactly the life she had chosen, that she had known true love, that she had been happy. They buried Florence beside Elijah on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the wide Arizona sky that had witnessed their love story. The entire family gathered, 3 generations strong, to say goodbye to the woman who had taught them all what courage looked like, who had shown them that it was possible to choose your own path, even when the world said you could not, who had loved and been loved completely. On the headstone, beneath their names and the dates that marked their time on earth, their grandchildren added a single line that summed up the story of Florence and Elijah Morrison. She ran to him, and together they built a beautiful life. And the desert wind blew across the hill, carrying with it the whisper of a love story that would be told for generations to come. A story of courage and choice, of running away from the wrong thing and toward the right thing, of 2 people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something that would last far beyond their years on earth. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, and the story of how it all began was never forgotten. Children were told about their great-great-grandmother, who had climbed out a church window, and their great-great-grandfather, who had found her in the desert and offered her the greatest gift anyone can offer, the freedom to choose. And those children grew up understanding that love is not about possession or obligation, but about partnership and respect, about choosing each other freely every single day. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Florence and Elijah were together again, hand in hand, watching over the family they had created and the legacy they had left behind. They had run to each other once in the Arizona desert on a day that changed everything, and they would be together forever. Proof that true love, freely chosen and courageously pursued, really does last beyond death, beyond time, beyond everything. Their story, the story of a woman who fled her wedding and a cowboy who found her, became more than just family history. It became a reminder that it is never too late to choose yourself, that courage can come from desperation, that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is run away from what is wrong so you can run toward what is right. And in Stillwater, Arizona, and all the places touched by their story, people would remember Florence and Elijah Morrison, and they would tell their children and their children's children about the power of a brave choice, about the importance of running to something rather than just away from something, about the beauty of a love built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. They would remember, and in remembering, they would be inspired to live their own lives with the same courage and conviction. The story ended not with an ending but with a beginning, repeated over and over through the generations. The beginning of new families, new loves, new acts of courage inspired by 2 people who chose each other freely and loved each other completely. And that, truly, is the best kind of happy ending. There is not an ending at all, but a beginning that never stops beginning, a love that never stops loving, a story that never stops inspiring, Florence had climbed out a window and run into the desert, terrified and uncertain. Elijah had found her and offered help without hesitation. Together, they had built something beautiful, something lasting, something worth remembering. They had shown the world what was possible when you were brave enough to choose yourself and lucky enough to find someone who chose you right back. And their legacy lived on, not just in the family they created, but in every person who heard their story and decided to be brave, to choose love, to run towards something beautiful instead of staying trapped in something that was slowly killing them. And so the story of Florence and Elijah Morrison, which began with a desperate escape and a chance encounter in the desert, became a story about hope, about love, about courage, about choosing yourself and finding someone who celebrates that choice. It became a story that would be told as long as there were people who needed to hear that it is possible to change your life, to escape what confines you, to find love that sees and celebrates who you really are. It was a story with a true happy ending, the kind of ending that is really just a beginning in disguise, the kind of love that lasts beyond one lifetime and inspires countless others. It was the story of a woman who was brave enough to run, and a man who was kind enough to help, and together they created something that would last forever. A family, a ranch, a legacy, and a love story for the ages.